integrity. I'm your host, Josh Porter, and today we're going to be talking about Florida Senate Bill 1702 and whether or not that has the potential to really change things here in Florida and be a model for the rest of the nation and the world, really, for how to handle condos, and to hopefully maybe see if something like this legislature can prevent the next condo collapse, right? One of the things I want to really point out in this is that there was a lot of input that went into Florida Senate Bill 1702. And in particular, there were 4 professional reports that were put out by different entities. And we're going to go through those, and we're going to go and look at their recommendations and some of the ideas that they had. And then we're going to talk about Senate Bill 1702 itself, what's inside that bill. And then we're going to have just a very brief discussion on what kind of changes we can expect that to actually bring to the industry. And really, at the heart of it, we're asking the question, is this something that will save lives in the future? Condos here in Florida, particularly, but around the whole world, are a relatively new concept. Yes, there are skyscrapers all over the world. There are some that are 100 years old, but a lot of these are owned by private commercial entities. The idea of the condominium, which is a building owned by a bunch of people, is a relatively, in human history, a relatively new concept. And so a lot of these, like particularly in Florida, I mean, we're only just now beginning to see buildings that are over 50 years old and just beginning to reach 60 years old. So, this is going to become a big problem as we move forward. As buildings age and get older, is there the money to repair them and all of the politics that go around that, right? Well, before I get into Senate Bill 1702, I want to talk about a bill that was in place in Florida in 2008. And I'm going to be reading here a little bit. Actually, I'm going to be reading a lot from this because there's a lot of notes I have on this, so you'll have to bear with me. But it says that the Florida legislature adopted, so in 2008, the Florida legislature had adopted a requirement that required any building over 3 stories in height. Now, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to be referring to those as threshold buildings, and the threshold being that it's over 3 stories in height. Now, there are other requirements for threshold, or other requirements that can meet the definition of a threshold building, but for the purposes of this video, we're going to be talking about condominiums, we're going to be talking about high rises, and we're going to be talking about threshold buildings, which basically means buildings over 3 stories in height. So this was a part of the Florida statutes, and the law required that buildings over 3 stories in height, so threshold buildings, be inspected by an architect or an engineer, attesting to the required maintenance, the useful life, and replacement costs of the common elements. But in 2010, this law was repealed, and when you go to the Senate staff report for when this law was repealed, the reason given was, and I quote, cost savings measures. So this is a bill or a law that was in place that might have helped the situation. I'm not going to say that, if this bill had not been repealed in 2010, then Champlain Tower South wouldn't have collapsed. I think that would be irresponsible to say. But it's certainly something that would have helped move the mindset of the public in the direction of taking better care of their buildings. All right, so let's start talking about the reports that were issued in Florida by various entities, and I'm going to list those, and we're going to go through some of what their suggestions were, and you'll see what some of these pieces ended up in the Senate Bill 1702 and not. The first one I want to talk about is the Broward County Mayor's Office Committee. So they put together a committee, and I'm not going to go through the entire report and give you everything, but I'm just going to kind of give you the bullet points, the highlights that I saw in there that I felt were worth mentioning. One, they wanted to talk about the Broward County, which is not where Champlain Tower South is. That was in Miami-Dade County. But Broward County is just to the north. But they also wanted to weigh in on this, being that they're so close, their citizens are concerned, right? So they came up with a committee, and they came up with 9 points that I'm going to talk about right now. One is to move the building and safety inspection from a 40-year program to, now follow along, to between 30 and 37 years. So you have between 30 and 37 years now to get your building inspection report done, and you have 3 years to comply. So essentially you have 40 years again, right? It's a very strange recommendation, but essentially they're recommending nothing change. They also recommend that it be re-inspected every 10 years thereafter. The building be re-inspected every 10 years thereafter. Well, that's already kind of part of the system. So there's nothing new there. They want all engineering reports. This is number 3. They want all engineering reports to be filed with the local government. Again, already a requirement for that area, I should say. Number 4, they want the building inspection report to be distributed to all residents within 30 days of receipt. I really like this. This is actually something new, and it's a good recommendation, and you'll see this play out in a couple of the other recommendations. The idea being that when an engineer gives the owner, which for a condominium is literally usually 5 to 7 people, which are consistent, they consist of the board, there's no real requirement that the board distribute that report to the residents. And what's interesting here is that it mentions residents, not owners. And that's another key point that I think is very wise, because a lot of times the building can be mostly owned by commercial entities that just rent out the condos, and they're not going to want to fix the building. But if the residents are aware that the building needs repairs and stuff, they can lobby against those private entities that are renting out those units and maybe force them to get these things fixed or repaired. Number 5. They recommend that reserve studies include restoration budgets. Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the way condos work, essentially there are these things called reserves, and it's money that you have to put away for future repairs. So like when you need the roof replaced, the condo's supposed to put money away for that. Well, they don't know how much money to put away without hiring somebody like myself or somebody else that does reserves to prepare what's called a reserve study. So it's a little report that tells them, you know, how long the roof is going to last, how long the paint's going to last, and so on and so forth, and how much money you need to put away for these things. Now, I have other videos on my channel about reserve studies, so I don't want to get into it too deep. But essentially, there's no requirement in Florida that reserve studies include budgets for restoring the structure of the building. And most people throughout the nation that prepare these types of studies are not equipped to actually estimate what it would cost or to evaluate the structural condition of the building. And that's going to be important later on, you'll see. 6, reserve studies must be done every 3 years. Okay, so I'm not against that. I'm not against reserve studies should include restoration budgets. But again, this is all based on this idea, and you'll see this repeated, that reserve studies a better reserve study would have stopped the collapse of Champlain Tower South. It would not have. Number 7, real estate sellers. So this, if you're going to sell your condo unit, you must provide the reserve study to a prospective buyer. That's okay, but you're going to see there's a better recommendation later on in these recommendations from these entities. Number 8, and again, this is all still coming from the Broward County Mayor's Office Committee. Number 8, they recommended that property managers be required to get biennial continuing education in building maintenance, building inspections, and reserves. Okay, I mean, they already have to get a bunch of continuing education, and facility care of the facility is already one of those categories where they have to get continuing education anyway. So I don't see that this is really an improvement on the way things are right now. And then lastly, number 9, board members must get required education and training. Again, this is kind of already a requirement in Florida, but I think they're intending that board members get better education regarding structural maintenance and repair of their buildings. So that kind of summarizes the Broward County Mayor's Office Committee, their findings, their report. The only thing I really like in there, honestly, is that the building inspection report be distributed to all residents within 30 days of the receipt. So if an engineer gives you a report, you have to get it to everybody living there. And I like that because that makes them aware of the condition of the building. So that's good. That moves us towards public safety. All right. The Community Associations Institute, also, this is a national institute here in America, and I'm sure they have fingers elsewhere outside of the country, but I'm not aware of that. But anyway, the Community Associations Institute also issued a recommended report, and you'll see that they also hyper-focused on reserve studies as if reserve studies would have saved the building. And I see this a lot where people think a reserve study does one thing and it actually does another thing, and they don't understand what it does. So Community Associations Institute, who actually has created the standards for reserve studies, kind of plays their cards and shows that they really don't understand what a reserve study does. But I'm going to go through 6 of the recommendations that stood out to me in their report. 1, they require that a bunch of different types of reserve studies be done at different times. I'm not going to get into all the breakdowns, but developers have to now do reserve studies. As soon as the developer hands over ownership of the association to the residents, then the residents have to get reserve studies, and they got to get them every so often and all this stuff. And that's all fine and dandy. But again, this is all based on the premise that a reserve study could save a building, or that a reserve study is a building inspection report by an engineer. And it's not. They're not one and the same. 2, require that real estate sales to disclose the reserve study to prospective buyers. So we just saw this in the Broward County Mayor's Office, also recommended the same thing. Again, under the premise that reserve studies can save buildings. They can't. 3, eliminate associations' abilities to waive reserves. I actually like this one. It's for a whole nother reason, probably a whole nother video. But the third recommendation from CAI, or Community Associations Institute, is that we eliminate the association's abilities to waive reserves. So what this means is, like, if I write a report for an association and I say you need to put away association $100,000 a year as an organization in order to pay for roofs, to pay for future restoration and stuff like that, as the law sits right now, they can actually vote to not fund the reserves at all or partially fund the reserves. And then what happens is that can gets kicked down the road, and then all of a sudden you're facing a $10, $14 million, 10, 12, whatever $million restoration, and you have no money in the bank. And then they're all running around saying, oh, this is too expensive, we can't afford to do this. Well, that's why I'm for not allowing them to waive reserves. They ought to be required to put money in there to protect the building's projects and to protect the building's budget as time moves on. Number 4 recommendation from CAI, allow the inclusion of engineering inspections as a reserve expense. Okay, now notice this doesn't require that reserve studies be engineering inspections, only that in the reserve study that you are allowed, not required, allowed to include the cost of these engineering inspections in there. So it's a little bit of a weird workaround, but I don't think it's going to be very effective. Number 5, they do recommend requiring that engineering inspections be done every 10 years for the first 20 years of a building's life, and then every 5 years thereafter. Now that's really good. I like that. They don't give a lot of feedback or instruction on how they expect that to play out or how that looks, but on the face of it, that's a good thing. I'm for something like that, right? Number 6, the last thing that popped out to me in their report was that they recommended, or that they're saying that it should be required that inspections be done by a licensed engineer, and they specifically exclude architects. Kudos to them. That's very good. And the reason why, don't get me wrong, I love architects. I love architecture. I like doing architectural photography. I'm a huge fan of architecture, but there are things that architects do that they're really good at that engineers really ought not to do. And there are things that engineers do that architects really ought not to do. And right now, the way the laws are written in Florida is there's a bunch of stuff that engineers can't do that architects can do. And then there's a bunch of things that engineers can do that also architects can do. And one of these things for a long time has been the structural evaluations of high-rises, which frankly, I've never met an architect in my life that's equipped to actually structurally evaluate a building, yet in the codes, it's always been written that architects can do this type of work. CAI is recommending that they exclude architects from doing these structural inspections, and I do like that. I think that's a great idea. Most architects I know, I should say as well, would not do these types of studies, but having it written out that architects aren't allowed to do it would prevent those rare architects that would try to do it from doing it and then harming the public. Okay, so the third report came out of the Miami-Dade County Grand Jury. I had the blessing to participate in that as an expert witness and to meet with the grand jury. I cannot tell you what I discussed with them, but that grand jury in Miami-Dade County has issued a report, and that report is public, and so we're going to go through that. Now, this thing has 11 points. I'm going to try to get through them as fast as possible. The first one is that the Miami-Dade County Grand Jury, which I'm just going to refer to as Grand Jury from now on, recommends hiring a geotechnical engineer to perform subsurface analysis on a routine schedule. I think that is unnecessary. And I think what you ought to do is when you have an engineering inspection, if the structural engineer says, hey, we need to also get some geotechnical data from a geotechnical engineer, I think that's the more appropriate way to do it. But just blindly requiring a geotechnical engineer, you're going to be spending a lot of money, and 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, it's going to be everything's fine. No worries here, right? I don't think geotechnical issues are usually what bring a lot of these buildings down. Despite some of the videos I've been putting out on the channel talking about geotechnical issues lately, I don't think that's usually a big concern for most condos. Number 2, building inspection report. They require that to be done every 10 to 15 years after construction and every 10 years thereafter. Very similar to the CAI's recommendation. I like that there be some sort of structural report done every 10 to 15 years. And then after that first one, or within 10 to 15 years of the building being built, and then every 10 years thereafter. I like something like that. That's good. 3, local building officials should ensure that condos are following the building inspection process. Well, This brings me to number 4. I'll kind of combine 3 and 4. Number 4 says that they should expand Miami-Dade's unsafe structures division. Now, what this means is that in Miami-Dade, because they've been doing the 40-year recertification program for a while, they actually had a branch of government that enforces it called the Unsafe Structures Division. And it's a bit of a convoluted bureaucratic process, but it exists nonetheless. And this is going to be something that you'll see pop up later on in the video, is even if we write a law, who's enforcing it? How does it get enforced? Is there any teeth behind it? And that's a big question. In Miami-Dade, there were teeth behind some of this stuff. In the Miami-Dade grand jury report, one of the things they recommended was expanding the Unsafe Structures Division because of the amount of property coming online that's over 40 years old. The current staffing that they had, there was no way that they were going to keep up with enforcing their local codes regarding these old structures. All right, so number 5, they also want to exclude architects from performing building inspection reports. Again, kudos to them. I think that when you see somebody say that, it's not anti-architect at all, but it just shows that they understand what's going on. They understand the implications of having an architect do a structural inspection report versus having a structural engineer do a structural inspection report. Number 6, they want to require that engineers that are performing inspections have previously, and I quote, designed and inspected at least 3 buildings of the same or greater height as the building which is to be recertified, end quote. So in other words, they're saying that any structural engineer that certifies a building or does a structural inspection of the building should be somebody who designs buildings. Well, this is very similar to the architect problem. Engineers who exclusively spend their career designing new structures know very little about how to maintain structures. They know very little about how structures age. They know very little about how to bid these projects out, how to manage these projects. They're very different from each other. I specialize in existing structures, and I have for most of my career now. And I can tell you, like, there's no way most design engineers I know could do what I do. Now, conversely, I can't really do what design engineers do. I would not sit down and tell you that I could responsibly design a 40-story tall building, for example. Okay, I wouldn't want to design that as a structural engineer from scratch. But 20 years later, I'll be happy to repair any aspect of that structure, no problem. Now, the other problem that this has is that it benefits those already working on large structures. So it creates a good old boy network where and I hate laws that are like this, that are written like this, especially ones that regulate engineering industry, where they're like, listen, the only people who can do this type of job are people who have already been doing this type of job. Well, then how do you bring in new competition into that situation? The only people who can ever do building inspections are people who already do building inspections? It seems a little shaky to me. And then lastly, the last comment I have on that is that again, the engineers that design typically don't know anything about restoration, and people who specialize in restoration know very little about design, and that's totally fine. That's okay. We need to come up with a better regulating structure for determining who's qualified to do these inspections or not. 7. So the 7th thing that came out of the grand jury, associations must provide local building official with building inspection reports. That's already part of their process. So I thought that was interesting that they sort of repeated it. I guess they're just saying they want to keep that going. Number 8, engineers also must have a duty to report to the building official. Again, so in other words, like if the engineer comes out and inspects the building, they need to be required to give that inspection report to the building official. That's already a thing in Miami-Dade, but I would like to see that become a statewide element as well. 9, they should require condos. So condos should be required to fund reserves, and they should eliminate the ability to waive funding. So again, that's just like the CAI's recommendation. You should be able to put money away to repair the building and to fix the building. You should be required to do that, and you should not be allowed to vote it out. I can't tell you how many associations I meet that vote to either just do no funding or to partially fund their reserves. So they have inadequate funds when something expensive comes along, like building restoration, structural restoration. Let's see. So number 10, they want additional education. So again, this is coming from the grand jury in Miami-Dade. They want additional education for property managers and board members. I'm not against that. I don't think additional education would have saved something like Champlain Tower South. I just don't think there was a lot of factors. We talked about all the contributing factors, but at the end of the day, the question keeps getting asked, well, why wasn't it fixed in 2016? Or why wasn't it fixed in 2018? Or why wasn't it fixed in 2019? And it wasn't for lack of education. The property managers, the board members, the residents all knew the building was in deleterious condition, yet nothing happened for year after year after year. So there was a whole political thing that went on there. So additional education isn't necessarily going to stop the next Champlain Towers South from collapsing. And then the last thing that came out of the grand jury that I thought was interesting was number 11, that they be required, all buildings, condo buildings, be required to paint and waterproof every 10 years. But there's no specification, there's no information given on what waterproofing means. Now, we know from Champlain Towers South that the pool deck, for example, had poor waterproofing and installed, and that the waterproofing was completely shot and gone for many years before the building collapsed. Water was leaking down into the parking garage and stuff like that. But there's a lot in the word waterproofing. We're also talking about primary and secondary sealants around windows. We're talking about the roof. We're talking about penetrations through the building. Should we waterproof the stucco? There's a lot of questions. And some of these things, which the industry has pushed, like waterproofing stucco, which was a super popular thing to do in the 90s and early 2000s, actually turned out to be a horrible idea and actually made the building worse. So just saying we ought to waterproof, or these buildings ought to be waterproofed every 10 years without giving some sort of instruction or specification to that is not wise in my opinion. I think it's better to say something like, follow the recommendations of your engineer, right? Require the report, require the engineering inspection report, and require that you follow their recommendations. I think that's probably a better way to go about it. Now, the fourth body here in Florida that kind of weighed in on this and issued a report, and this is a bit of a mouthful, it is the Florida Bar Condominium Law and Policy Life Safety Advisory Task Force. And if you didn't think that was a mouthful, it was a brainchild. So this task force is the brainchild of the Condominium and Planned Development Committee of the Real Property Probate and Trust Law section of the Florida Bar. And if you can't figure out through all those words, this was a report written by attorneys. So the first thing out of this report that they issued was that they wanted to add waterproofing to the Florida statutes as a requirement of maintenance. Again, no instruction or specification on what waterproofing means, where should we waterproof, what shouldn't we waterproof. Sometimes waterproofing things is a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. So again, just a blanket statement of, well, it should be added to maintenance, I think is inappropriate. 2, associations don't have to pay residents for being displaced while repairs are being made. Okay, I have no problem with that. I didn't know that was already a problem, but fine, whatever. And so what that basically means is, like, if the building's being restored and you need to get out of your unit in order for the condo board to get the building properly restored, that the condo association doesn't have to pay your displacement costs. It seems odd because the residents are the association. So if the association was required to pay the residents' displacement costs, isn't that just the same thing as the resident paying their own displacement costs? I've never seen this come up in practice in my line of work, but nonetheless, they're recommending that it be added to the law. Third item, make clear that building repairs are not material alterations. So again, you're going to need a little definition of what a material alteration is. A material alteration is when something substantially changes in the building, particularly with the way it looks, okay? Or the way it functions and flows. So for example, if you bought a condo in a building that had a mid-century modern design and 3 or 4 board members decided that they wanted to make the exterior of the building look like a Tuscan villa, then it's called a material alteration. You are completely changing the look of the building, and that requires a massive vote from the majority of the people living in that condo to make that material alteration come to life. And in fact, even changing the color on your building is considered a material alteration and requires a massive vote. If you've ever driven by a condo building and you wondered to yourself, why is this giant pink monstrosity why does it still look this ugly? Why is it still pink? That was only popular in the 80s. It's because of this material alteration. So what they want to do is they want to make sure in the law, and this is again the Florida Bar's task force, they want to make sure in the law that building repairs aren't considered material alterations. Well, building repairs, as far as I know, are already not considered material alterations. 4, anyway, moving on. So 4, boards should be allowed to get loans for projects without resident vote. I thought they already could do that, but apparently that needs to be codified. Number 5, they want to add waterproofing to the developer turnover report. And again, this is going to be definition time. What is a developer turnover report? Well, a developer builds a condo building, right? And they sell the units. Well, as they sell the units, they are required by law eventually to turn over ownership and control of that building to the residents that bought these units. That is called developer turnover, that process. When that process occurs, they are now required by law to give a report. And this report is supposed to comment on things like how to maintain the building and what money you should put away into reserves and stuff like that. And apparently the Florida Bar Task Force wants this report, which is already a useless document in my experience. And I'll tell you why, and I'm not afraid to tell you why. It's because the developer will hire an engineer. He has to pay the engineer to write this report. The engineer is not going to get paid if they produce a report that the developer doesn't like. So the engineering firm is incentivized to write a very flimsy, thin report. And so adding waterproofing to this flimsy, thin report is laughable, really. It's not going to do anything. Number 6, oh, and also there's almost no penalty for a developer to just not even turn in this report. Because again, a lot of law in Florida is not criminal law, it's civil law. So if you don't get this report, then you have to sue the developer for the report. And the amount it costs you to sue the developer to get this report is more than you just hiring somebody to get the report yourself. So a lot of times developers don't even turn in these reports. Number 6, require reserve studies for buildings 3 stories or greater. I don't have a problem with that, but again, it's not going to save buildings from collapsing. Number 7, they want to eliminate pooled reserves from reserve studies. You're going to get a lot of definitions in this video. What is a pooled reserve? A pooled reserve essentially allows you to put all of the money that you need for the roof, the painting, the paving, any repairs and building restoration that you're going to need in the future, to put them all into one account. And if one project goes over a little bit, you can simply pay for that overage without having to completely reinvent the wheel. Eliminating pooled reserves would set back the accounting for the way reserve funds are accounted. It would set them back into the Stone Ages. It just shows me that the Florida Bar Task Force doesn't even know what a reserve study is, and they definitely don't know what pooled reserves are. They think they do, but they don't. And if they would like to know, they can email me and I will be happy to meet with them. Number 8, the property manager should make specific recommendations to, so this is, remember, this is the Florida Bar Task Force. They're recommending that a law be passed requiring property managers to make specific recommendations to and advise boards, condo boards, on proper maintenance. So in other words, what they want to do is they want the law to require property managers to essentially do what a structural engineering consultant would do. This is a really bad idea. What should be done is that property managers should be required to advise boards to hire a structural engineer. And that's it. Don't require them to advise boards on proper maintenance. A property manager is not there to do that. That's not in their job description. That's not in their wheelhouse. Number 9, Florida Bar Task Force wants to void any limits of liability for property managers or consulting professionals. Again, eliminating a limit of liability in a contract between somebody like myself, let's say, and a condo board is not going to prevent the next Champlain Tower South from collapsing. What it's going to do is it's going to allow more civil lawsuits to be filed, and it's going to, which means more work for attorneys. So you can see why the Florida Bar Task Force is recommending that these limits of liability be removed. It's not to protect condo boards. I have plenty of condo boards that read my contract and want me to eliminate that, or they negotiate a different limit of liability than what I had put into my base contract. That's fine. This is contract negotiation between 2 private parties. But having a law that eliminates this only feeds attorneys. That's all it does. And then 10, and then out of all my complaints with the Florida Bar Task Force report, which was probably the worst report of all of them, the only silver lining to this whole thing is this beauty of number 10. They want to remove sovereign immunity for local governments and building departments. I love that. That is awesome. Right now, it's been Florida law for as long as I can imagine, and it's probably this way in many states around the entire country, and it's probably like this in a lot of countries around the world. But the local building official, whoever that may be, we call them the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction. In Florida, the authority having jurisdiction is essentially immune under sovereign immunity laws from any civil liability. So they cannot be sued for, I'll give you an example. If they came out and inspected a building and said, yes, this building is safe, and then a week later it collapses, and then we all find out that that inspector never actually inspected it and he took a $500 cash under the table, that inspector cannot be sued. He can be fired, but he cannot be sued, and the building department can't be sued. They have complete sovereign immunity, and this gem of a recommendation from the Florida Bar Task Force recommends that sovereign immunity be removed from local governments and building departments. I love it, because what it's going to do is, first off, you're going to think, oh, this is going to be terrible. Everybody's going to be suing the building department. No, what's going to happen is building departments are going to stop doing a lot of inspections on their own that they're not equipped to do. They can continue doing inspections that they're equipped to do, which they're very good at. But they also do a lot of inspections that they're not really equipped to do. And what this is going to do is this is going to force them to require the developer or require the contractor or require the building owner to get private inspections done by a private engineering firm or construction management firm. And it's going to shift this pseudo responsibility that has not really been followed too well over the years in Florida by building inspectors. It's going to shift that responsibility over to the private sector, which I am a big fan of. All right, so these 4 reports came out from these 4 entities, and then Senate Bill 1702 was developed. And I also had the honor of talking to a couple of the attorneys for the Florida Senate, which was advising our Florida senators on this bill before it got put into place. And I got to talk with them for an hour or 2 on the phone. So that was really, I got to give my 2 cents in on it. Now, I don't know how much of it they used or not, but I will tell you, despite all of those recommendations that we just went through, all those reports that we just went to, Senate Bill 1702 is actually pretty darn good. First thing to do, I want to break this down into 7 quick notes. First note is that the first thing that the Senate Bill 1702 does is it establishes a new term that we don't have currently in our industry called a milestone inspection. And I love this because instead of calling it a structural inspection or a building inspection or a condition survey, which can be confused with existing services that consultants provide, they decided to create a new term called a milestone inspection. I really like that because now it's very clear what we're all talking about when we talk about a milestone inspection in the industry. So a milestone inspection has 3 pieces to it. 1, it should attest to the life safety of the building. It should also attest to the structural components of the building, and it should, to the best of the engineer's ability, determine the general structural condition of the building. So these are very specific things that must be commented on in a milestone inspection report. Who should have these reports done? Again, owners of threshold buildings. So any buildings greater than 3 stories in height. Now, here's what I really like. They put a lot of thought into this, and this is something that I had recommended to the attorneys. I don't know if they actually followed, my advice, but it syncs up exactly with what I told them. 1, how often should this report be done, this milestone inspection report? Senate Bill 1702 says that the milestone inspection report should be done within 30 years of when the building was built, unless that building is called a coastal, is close to the coast. And what do they define as being close to the coast? Within 3 miles of the coast. So if the building is within 3 miles of the coast, that first milestone inspection done by a structural engineer should be done within 20 years of when the building was built. And that was a distinction that none of the other reports made. And that was something that I told the senators or the attorneys working for the Florida Senate. This is something I told them. I was like, a distinction must be made between coastal structures and inland structures. And inland structures can go 30 years, no problem. But coastal structures should not go any more than 20 years without being inspected. All right, so anyway, going on. They say that the milestone inspections must be done within 30 years or 20 years if you're coastal, and then every 10 years or 7 years thereafter. Now, again, the 7 years, why 7? This is super important. One of the things I tried to explain to the attorneys at the Florida Senate was that a building is typically painted every 7 years. And the reason why is because of how long paint lasts, the way paint warranties are, and just simply, basically, most of it's driven by the painting industry. So if you're going to paint your high-rise building every 7 years and you've got all this expensive staging put up around the building, it's the perfect opportunity for an engineer to ride some of that swing staging and physically inspect the structure of the building. So Again, I don't know if this was because of anything I advised them on or if they had already decided on this 7-year, but it totally aligns with my thinking on the subject. So if it's a coastal structure, every 7 years it should be inspected, a milestone inspection after its initial, and then if it's an inland structure, every 10 years thereafter. I think those are great years, great time frames. And then lastly, if it's already, so once this law gets passed, if your building is already 30 years old, your first milestone inspection must be done by the end of 2024. That's pretty tight time window, to be honest with you, given the way laws work. And this law may not even get enacted until I think July 1st is when they're hoping that it will get enacted if it passes everything. So that basically means that associations have a year and a half to find an engineer and get this milestone inspection done if their building's already 30 years old. And trust me, there are lots and lots of condos just in Florida alone that are over 30 years old. All right, now what is the milestone inspection? It has 2 phases according to Senate Bill 1702. Phase 1 can be performed, again, by an architect or engineer. I'm not super excited about the architect part, but they were pretty clever on this. So phase 1 says an architect or engineer can perform, and then if there are no signs of distress observed, then you don't have to go into phase 2 of the milestone inspection. But if signs of distress are observed, and I wish they'd done a better job of like defining what that means. Is an architect qualified to determine if a building's in distress or not? So these are all kinds of gray area questions, but you can't expect a bill to do everything for you. So some of it's going to have to be done through precedents, which is essentially how our law system works here in our country anyway. But let's say there are signs of distress, and then you have to go into phase 2. Well, then another inspection has to be performed by a structural engineer with a special inspector license, okay? I am a structural engineer, for example. I have a special inspector license. I am licensed to go and inspect existing threshold buildings, okay? Now, phase 2 requires a report done by a special inspector, and this report may involve destructive and non-destructive testing techniques. So they're saying, listen, we're not going to completely close architects out of being able to do the phase 1 inspections, but if you've got to do a phase 2 inspection, if there's any signs of distress, we want somebody serious to come out to this building, take a look at it, and issue a report. Now, this milestone inspection report then has to be turned over to the building owner, and it has to be turned over to the local building official. This isn't that different from what Miami-Dade is doing, except Senate Bill 1702 is statewide. Okay, so this is taking something that was happening in a very small part of Florida, and it's blasting it out to the entire state, which I'm all for. That's fine. I'm good with that. Let's see, what am I on? That was number 4. Number 5, copies of the report must be distributed to each unit owner. Now 1702 says unit owner, and I really wish they had put in there unit owner and current resident, because I think it's very important for these condo buildings that are mostly owned by investors. They're all going to get these reports, but the people actually living in the building don't have to get the report under 1702. So I listen, if you're if you're listening to this video and you have any power in Florida Senate to make any decisions, please don't slow down or stop Senate Bill 1702 on my account, but maybe for a future amendment, you consider adding residents to the description of Senate Bill 1702. This report should really be put into the hands of the people whose lives could be at risk. Number 6, Senate Bill 1702 requires, and I like this. So if you remember in previous reports, in the two of the 4 previous reports I talked about, they wanted during real estate transactions that people get reserve studies. And reserve studies are great. I sell them, we do them, like they're really good things to have done for a condo, but they're not structural inspection reports. They're not the same thing. And so that was kind of useless to require real estate transactions to involve transfer of a reserve study. But what Senate Bill 1702 does is it says that it requires all real estate transactions to transmit to prospective buyers all of these milestone inspection reports. And it doesn't say like recent milestone inspection reports or the last milestone inspection reports. It's like the entire building's history, every milestone inspection report that's ever been done. If you're selling your condo, you must deliver those to the person buying your condo. And then Senate Bill 1702 goes one step further, and it says that it gives the buyer the right to cancel the real estate contract after seeing the milestone inspection report. Now, I'm paraphrasing. Senate Bill 1702 doesn't say it exactly like that. But essentially, if you're the buyer and you're under contract, and regardless of whatever other timeframes or anything else that's going on, if you finally get the milestone inspection report and it's 2 years old and it says this building's in deleterious condition and needs millions and millions of dollars of repairs, Senate Bill 1702 gives you the right to cancel your contract and get your money back out of escrow. And then the last piece of this Senate Bill 1702 is the fact that they want this thing enacted July 1st of 2022. Now, I don't know if that date's going to get pushed back or not, but I can tell you that Senate Bill 1702 has passed through subcommittees, several subcommittees, and it has even passed through a couple subcommittee of subcommittees. You know, you got to love how our bureaucratic government works. But in every committee that this bill has gone through, it has been unanimously voted yay versus nay. So the question then comes up, if Senate Bill 1702 gets put into place, let's say it gets put into place July 1st, 2022, the questions are, will this bill prevent the next collapse? And so these are just my personal comments. And this is one, it's a great framework. I think Senate Bill 1702 is really good. It's probably better. Like, it's really shocking to me that the law was written better than these four major reporting entities recommended be put into the law. I mean, somebody really smart put this law together. And the other thing I like about the law is it's pretty succinct. I mean, in this day and age, we see bureaucrats and senators and legislators writing laws that are just a gajillion pages. Nobody even knows what's in them or how to work them. This is a very simple, straightforward law. I was able to read it within 30 minutes. I mean, you know, it was 9 pages total. It's a very easy read. It's very straightforward, makes a lot of sense. And yes, there's some things they could have clarified or made a little better, but you know, I'm not complaining. But while it's a great framework, you have to understand what it's going to do is it's going to create these structural inspection reports, and it's going to raise awareness to the owners, and so on and so forth. When you look at Champlain Tower South, they had a structural engineering report. The residents were aware of the condition of the building for the most part. The board was aware of the condition of the building. People, when they parked their car in the parking garage, could look up and be generally aware that something's not right. So the big question is will Senate Bill 1702 prevent the next Champlain Tower South from collapsing? I'm not so sure. I think it could prevent some future buildings from collapsing because it's raising awareness, because it's improving communication, and because it's making people think of things. I think more so than Senate Bill 1702, it's really sad to say, but the collapse of Champlain Tower South itself will be the main motivating factor for preventing the next collapse. You understand what I'm saying? We get calls all the time from residents and boards and condos, you know, all over our service area in Florida, calling us and voluntarily wanting structural inspection reports of their buildings because they saw what happened with Champlain Tower South. So that's the biggest motivator of all for change is you've got to change the mentality of people. Again, the people and residents and board members of Champlain Tower South generally had all the tools they needed to get the building fixed. But nonetheless, the can just kept getting kicked down the road. And so I think, you know, while 1702 will create some laws, and it is a law that will create some requirements on boards, it will create requirements on engineers, and it will improve communication, it will improve public awareness, resident awareness of what the condition of their building is. And while it will do all these things, I don't think it by itself, like I said, will really prevent the next collapse by itself. And the main reason why is because at its heart, it's a civil law. So who's going to enforce this law? For example, who is going to make sure that the association at the 20-year mark gets their first milestone inspection report? What happens if they don't get their milestone inspection report? I mean, there's literally, I didn't see anything in Senate Bill 1702 or anywhere else in the Florida statutes that really assigns any criminal charges, any penalties, any fees, doesn't put the condo into some sort of receivership, or the state government can't come in and take over running the condo. Like, none of that is really in there outlined. And so what it does is it creates a civil law structure by which the residents, so let's say a milestone inspection report never gets done. Well, how do you enforce Senate Bill 1702? Well, now you have to have residents that are aware of Senate Bill 1702. And they're aware that, hey, shouldn't we have gotten a milestone inspection report? And the board says, don't worry about it. And then that resident has to take it upon themselves to hire an attorney and sue the board in order to force them to get the report done. Because again, at the end of the day, Senate Bill 1702 is really about civil law. So I am hopeful for the future. I like where we're going. I do like Senate Bill 1702. I think a lot of condo boards, because of what happened to Champlain Tower South, have a lot more awareness and a lot more concern. 1702 gives them a framework that they can follow. I think a lot of people will voluntarily follow this, but you're still going to have condo boards out there that want to bury their heads in the sand. They will use the excuse that they can't afford the repairs or whatever, and you're going to have more buildings, hopefully, that don't collapse, but hopefully building officials and engineers can catch these buildings before then, and the building officials can have some sort of power to go in there and have the building evacuated until it can be thoroughly assessed and evaluated in the effort of, public safety and saving people's lives. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.